in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
We know that stitch is still somewhat mysterious, and it's likely caused in many cases by either fluid or food in the stomach. Like that definitely causes stitch in many cases. In the other cases, it's not so clear, and the presentation of it can be different in people. But there is some convincing evidence, at least convinced me, that phrenic nerve irritation is to blame, and perhaps that breathing, or especially exhaling on the same leg repeatedly, can irritate that nerve. And so, this is just one way that perhaps one of these breathing techniques can be operationalized pretty quickly and easily for people is, if you just alternate which legs that you're exhaling on, that actually attenuates that stitch.
Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a Ph.D. in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Eric Harbour, where we're going to discuss the physiology of breathing and how to improve your breathing patterns. Eric has a Ph.D. in sports biomechanics with a focus on breathing pattern in sport. He is a broadly experienced practitioner with a sports medicine background and has worked in NCAA athletics, alpine ski racing, and New Zealand rugby. His current role as a postdoctoral research scientist is in collaboration with Adidas and other companies developing analytical approaches and wearable feedback interfaces to better understand and improve sports experiences. He's a runner, cyclist, and keen outdoor athlete, and currently lives with his wife, child, and dog in Salzburg, Austria. Dr. Eric Harbour, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Super cool. After listening to some of your breathing episodes, I think we need to talk.
Yeah, no, I got really into, like this idea of breathing and how breathing can affect, your physiology, your psychology, those sort of things, like obviously with 3 episodes, I think in a row that were all breathing related. And it's something that's also been on my mind in terms of sports performance, because I work for Moxie Monitor, which is a near-infrared spectroscopy company. And one of the people who was involved really, really early on came up with this idea of a limiter assessment. So you put your Moxie Monitor on, you go through, essentially a broken step test, and then you can identify or get an idea, is your performance limited by your ability for your pulmonary system to uptake oxygen and off-gas CO2, your cardiovascular system to transport that oxygen to your working muscle, or your working muscle's ability to utilize that oxygen. And if you look in terms of like the literature and stuff like that, most people would say, oh, well, your VO2 max, and then therefore, your performance in kind of shorter events is probably limited by your cardiovascular system. But I think as we know now, it's much more nuanced than that. And this idea of a pulmonary limitation kind of came to light. So talking to all these people who had done these limiter assessments, they're like, like almost 80% of the time, unless somebody was like really untrained, a pulmonary limitation was actually what was going on. And I'm not saying pulmonary limitation by just like say size of the lungs or something, but it was more coordination of breathing. So I got really into that, wanted to, kind of look at what the experts were saying. There's these books that were written, like I think it's called like The Oxygen Advantage and some other things. And then people were telling me, go ahead.
The Patrick McEwen book, Oxygen Advantage, and Breathe was another recent one. James Nestor, a lot of new attention to this. Definitely the zeitgeist.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the idea is that because breathing is both, kind of controllable consciously and subconsciously, that you could have some influence over, your sympathetic and parasympathetic, sort of interplay by just breathing better. But as we will see, it's not always just do nasal breathing, just do slow breathing, just do this. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And I don't remember if you reached out to me initially or if somebody else reached out to me, but they sent me a video of you talking about your breath tools at a conference that you did. And so I watched that, and it was like, it was a 20-minute presentation or something. And then it actually resonated a lot with me because, you were talking about, breathing patterns in runners and how side stitch can be related to synchronization.
Can
And
be.
yeah, and there was a guy that I've been working with for a long time who's actually been on the show quite a bit, David Melman. So David, this is for you. He was having issues with the side stitch. So I sent him that video and I was like, hey, like this could be one of the issues that you're having. And I don't remember. I'll have to reach out to him and see if it helped. But yeah, so that was like my initial introduction to you. And I was like, oh, that'd be really cool then to get him on. And then when I went back to try to find you like on Instagram or something like that, I just like absolutely couldn't, because normally that's how I operate. And so I had to go. I think all the way to LinkedIn. There. Yeah, yep. I had to go all the way to LinkedIn to be like, hey man, I would love to get you on the podcast and stuff like that. And now we finally made it happen. So
sweet.
Again, I appreciate all your time and stuff like that. Let's start with and he's just an expert in breathing. So that's also why I wanted to pursue it, because I like to get a researcher's perspective on this sort of stuff. So why not go to the source? So let's just start with a little bit of your background. How did you get all the way to Salzburg, Austria, other than by plane? And what made you interested in, say, like breathing and those sort of things? Because I know you have a background in athletic training, but so we can start there and then just get you to.
Yeah. Let's see. I started as an athlete. I was a ski racer, played hockey, basically every other sport, and then drove me just in my bachelor's, did athletic training, sports medicine, maybe sports physio for international guests. And then ended up working in ski racing for some time in Colorado for almost 5 years. And that was really cool. And then ended up going to New Zealand, did a master's degree there. It was mostly with New Zealand kayak, and in some of these, they developed a prototype power blade that was measuring power to some degree. So really interesting, definitely more challenging than rowing because of some of the mechanical constraints. And so it was really like a sports tech data analysis project that just in an unplanned way set me up perfect for a PhD opportunity, where at a conference I met my current boss, the head of our department here in biomechanics, and they had a project that had something to do with wearables and industry and running. And I said, yeah, that sounds great. I'm in. And I think at the beginning they had some ambitious but also vague sort of intentions for this project. They wanted to make wearables more useful or more user-friendly, and also to help potentially improve like the feeling of running. Since they know that, performance is important for some people, but there's a large contingent of runners who feel it difficult to motivate themselves or run for head clearing reasons, more psychological reasons. And we wanted to know maybe how that interacts with the physiology, the biomechanics, et cetera. And for me, breathing was like the perfect avenue there. I said, hey, this is both, this is a psychological and physiological, consequence, we could say, and also can be influenced, right? There's a lot of correlations with feeling, with effort, with stress, and other elements that can influence breathing, but also breathing itself can influence those things. So I thought this was a perfect sort of start. And I should just say, I am not a breathing expert, whatever that is, but I'm trying to be. Definitely.
Yes.
So we've been working on it now for about 5 years, and we'll continue doing so for at least the near future, because it's clear that there's a lot more to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And said like I think like a true, sort of like PhD academician, like, hey guys, like, I don't feel like, I am an expert, but I think compared to most of us, especially me, people listening to this podcast, you certainly have a lot more experience, thinking about, like these concepts, especially, not only from like the just pure physiological side of things and like the function side of things, but also the interventional side of things. So, when you have a great review that's labeled breath tools, or, and then something about how to improve your breathing, I think that kind of puts you up, just to toot your own horn a little bit more for you. I'm embarrassing him, guys, but
thank you.
But yeah, no, that's really cool. I think let's just start with you had some statements that this popularity in breathing and those sort of things, and let's just, I just want to kind of start with it. And, because you made extensive notes, which was great before the podcast episode and stuff. And one of them you said is breath control is everything, or breathing is automatic and shouldn't be changed. So why did you write that?
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that we hear both on so many different forums these days, right? Within your own podcast, I heard both of those statements by different people. And, the claim on one side that like breathing is everything and it can make a huge difference in your performance, it can raise your VO2 max by 20% or whatever. Like that's an outrageous claim. And such claims require evidence. On the other hand, there's lots of we can say more conventional physiology field that has been studying for breathing for hundreds of years, since the late 1800s, I would say is really when it started. And a lot of them have argued for decades that breathing is this near perfect automatic physiological process that is tightly regulated based on primarily CO2 and other factors. And any attempts to change it are ineffective or potentially harmful.
Right.
And the reality has to be somewhere in between, because the second part's just not true. We know that there are a number of different ways that breathing can be changed that are beneficial. But the nuance in there is really what fascinates me. So I think the reality is somewhere in between, and that's what we should dive into.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, with that, if you wouldn't mind giving us like a brief kind of anatomy physiology lesson on like what is breathing, I think that's a really good place to start. Just get everybody on the same page, and then we can go into, is it possible to change it? Can we change the anatomy, the physiology, those sort of things?
Yeah. I think that's a useful place to start, because it often gets mixed with other terms in especially sports science. We should make a distinction between breathing pattern, which I would say is sort of the behavior of ventilation, right? Or how ventilation is achieved. We should distinguish that with ventilation itself, which is the simple movement of air in and out. We can measure that, of course, in liters per minute. With also respiration, right? Which respiration is really gas exchange. And that, of course, happens at different levels, whether it's cellular or more broadly. And then we have other specific concepts like pulmonary function, like how the lungs actually function. And we think of tests like forced vital capacity, maximum voluntary ventilation. That's a specific thing. But when I think about breathing pattern, it's simply the behavior of breathing, of how VE is achieved. And so ventilation, the same 100 liters per minute, can be achieved via different patterns of rate and depth, right? And even if we break that down farther, we have different coordinations, different mechanics, different contributions of the upper versus diaphragmatic rib cage that can, again, achieve the same VE. And this is important because there's a number of different psychological, physiological, and biomechanical factors that influence those variables, that influence breathing pattern. And then, of course, where my work wants to take that a step farther is, okay, can we turn that arrow around? Can we use breathing pattern to affect those psychological, physiological, or biomechanical determinants? And so I think that's useful to think about breathing pattern. And usually I have a figure that I usually share on this, but I think it's cool to think about it in terms of like timing, depth, and coordination. Maybe if we want to also consider airway or airway choice in there, nasal versus oral, or a mix of nasal oral, that's also an element of breathing pattern that warrants discussion.
Yeah, let's immediately what kind of came to mind is like I've talked a lot about say VO2 max, and that's dictated very simplistically by the Fick equation, which is cardiac output times AVO2 diff. Cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume. So very similarly to that, ventilation, or the amount of the liters of air you can move per minute, VE, minute ventilation, is the product of breathing rate and tidal volume. Breathing rate is that frequency we were talking about. How quickly are you breathing in and out? And then tidal volume is the depth. How deeply, how much air are you moving per breath? So you got that. And then you started to talk about, well, the coordination is also important. So you could be breathing primarily into, like your upper chest. You could be breathing a little bit more deeply, diaphragmatic breathing,
Mhm.
or a combination of the two. And then on top of that, make it more complicated, you could be breathing through your nose, you could be breathing through your mouth, or a combination of the two as well. And there's probably different physiological benefits and those sort of things. So um let's just track from the environment how air, gets to, say, your lungs and your alveoli. Because there was a mention of like things like dead space and like other things like that I want to just clarify for people. So yeah, I'll let you describe that, and then we can just say goes through the airway, whether that's nose or mouth. It doesn't really
Sure.
matter right at this moment. But let's just trace the pathway of air to the alveoli, because that's ultimately what we're focusing on today.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a number of different breathing muscles, right? I've heard estimates anywhere between 20 and 60 muscles contributing to ventilation. And of course, those need to act in some coordinated manner in order to generate negative pressure, which
Mm-hmm.
creates inhalation, right? By expanding the rib cage and or parts of the upper abdomen. This creates negative pressure. Air is sucked in. And then, of course, the opposite, usually at rest, exhalation is passive. So simply when those muscles relax, that pressure squeezes the air out. When during exercise, we have more active inhalation, primarily the internal oblique is the primary expiratory muscle, and all these other muscles contribute as well to some degree to exhalation. This causes, of course, air to be inspired either
Mm-hmm.
through the mouth or the nose, and eventually that air makes its way to the alveoli where gas is actually exchanged, right? Where that CO2 is onboarded and then CO2 is offloaded. And
Mm-hmm.
between there, I think this is where you were trying to get to. There's, of course, some dead space. So there's basically from the surface of our lips or from the nose between there to the upper lung, there's approximately 150 milliliters, more or less, depending on your body size, of simply airway that doesn't participate in that gas exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really interesting where, of course, the airway has an important role in breathing pattern. And things like airway choice can affect the patency or the quality of that airway in different other pathologies, diseases, environments, etc. But how it affects actually where you started, this equation of breathing rate times tidal volume equals VE, is also interesting. Because when we think that volume of dead space is a fixed amount of space, this implies that a certain amount of that, a fixed amount of that tidal volume is not respired, right? That gas is not
Mm-hmm.
exchanged. So inevitably, and this is oversimplistic, but inevitably that implies that a larger tidal volume and a slower breathing rate for the same VE at isoventilation is more efficient because a greater percentage of that breath is actually respired. Right. So we have a table of this in this breath tools paper that you mentioned, although this actually comes from a study that was done almost 50 years ago that inspired that, so to speak. And people have known this for a long time, that for the same ventilation, a larger tidal volume and a smaller breathing rate, a lower breathing rate would be more efficient. Although that also butts up against some of these ideas of minimal effort, where pressure and tension volume relationships can sort of defeat whether that's indeed more efficient or not. But I think the important conclusion there is that it's malleable, that this is indeed something we can change, the rate or the depth.
Yeah. So now we've kind of established, right, the amount of air you're moving. It's important, right, to move oxygen in, and and the whole. Let me just take a step back. The whole purpose, well, the main purpose of kind of like just breathing in general is A, to get oxygen in, and then B, to get CO2 out, right? And by getting oxygen in, if we're thinking on that side of the oxygen transport pathway, that gives you the ability to get oxygen to eventually the working muscle through this cascade of events, of respiration events. And ultimately that oxygen is used to facilitate the resynthesis of ATP, or, like the energy currency of the cell, right?
Yes.
And then on the flip side of things, through all of this respiration, you're creating, at least in part, CO2. With muscle contraction, you're creating a lot of protons, positive hydrogen ions, and both that CO2's got to go somewhere because of buffering mechanisms within our blood that can tilt metabolic acidosis one way or the other. So if we don't get enough CO2 out, then we actually push our buffering mechanism the opposite way, and then we could result in higher metabolic acidosis within the muscle. And we know, at least in part, that proton concentration, or pH, is extremely related to fatigue. So there's two sides of the equation, and I just want to get that out there because I think a lot of the times as I'm reading these pulmonary, physiology papers and stuff, there's a lot of focus on the oxygen side, and people say, oh, well, because oxygen in, like the arteries is never really going down, therefore, and this is very simplistic conclusion, therefore, there's not really a pulmonary limitation in a sense, when we also have to look on the other side of things and say, well, CO2 is important here as well. I'm not saying that CO2 is the ultimate dictator of everything, which is what some of the conclusions that popular books have kind of come to. But it's just important to get an idea of what both functions are here.
Yeah. But this last point that you mentioned, this arterial hypoxemia, has actually been increasingly noticed just in recent years in the literature, especially in elite athletes. So this is not a problem in most of the population, but in elite athletes in whom we know that they already operate at the edges of what the pulmonary system is capable of. They do experience, some people do experience this drop in oxygen concentration in the arteries, and that's a problem. And that's probably a breathing problem, or at least a pulmonary limitation, we should say. I mean, it's super interesting. So most of what you described, though, of course, this is a more physiology podcast. These are the physiological reasons that we breathe, right? Or the reasons we ventilate. But breathing pattern is something specific, because what influences the breathing depth is different than rate, and it's different at rest than it is during exercise, right? So we know that breathing has specific psychological purposes at rest as well, right? It's used to entrain certain parts of the brain neurologically. We know that people take a deep sigh, right? Sighing both has a physiological purpose, which is related to atelectasis of the alveoli, maybe to pop them back open when they collapse, but it also has a psychological purpose, right? Which is relief, or anticipation of relief. I'm sure you've seen somebody on the starting line at a race or at a triathlon. They do this sigh. Whether that's conscious or spontaneous, that's a whole nother interesting question. But there's other purposes that we breathe in, and this is really interesting. So maybe to bring it more to the topic of the podcast, what drives breathing during exercise is also fascinating, and there's a lot of good new-ish work on this by one of my favorite recent authors is Andrea Nicolo, who out of Rome has been doing some interesting stuff relating to breathing rate versus depth. And what they see is that as exercise intensity increases, the inputs that drive breathing rate are distinct from tidal volume. So it's mainly more psychological, or what they call this sort of central effort, right? And it's more sort of top down, what's driving breathing rate to increase together with effort, while tidal volume sort of adjusts secondary to breathing rate to maintain some sort of biochemical homeostasis. So that's where metabolic acidosis is going to primarily, at higher exercise intensities, drive depth more than rate. And this is interesting to see how those diverge. And maybe that ties back to your understanding of limiters. When we see these trends of breathing rate and tidal volume, we know that these can increase or plateau differently in different types of athletes. And there is some evidence, for example, that more high level athletes have a plateau in tidal volume later in an incremental exercise test, more maybe closer to VT2 versus more novice athletes closer to VT1. We see a tidal volume plateau that's around 50 to 60% of vital capacity, something like that.
Yeah, that's all of these parallels because like when I teach or taught, cardiovascular physiology, right? We're looking at cardiac output. Cardiac output, again, product of heart rate and stroke volume. And I'm making these connections because it just makes sense to me.
Sure.
It used to be thought that stroke volume plateaued around 40% of VO2 max or something along those lines. Now we know that that's not the case for every population. Some people, it does plateau. Other people, especially, it was really interesting. I was reading about cardiac output changes in females. Doesn't seem like females really have that plateau, even untrained females. Whereas males, who are the primary population that was being studied, do have that plateau. And then elite level athletes don't really have that plateau either. So, again, it's just really fascinating that now there's a connection between, there was even a mention of tidal volume could almost increase in some elite level athletes, like until failure, which also is really interesting. So I guess this is a perfect segue to, like the question, right? Can breathing, or can your anatomy of breathing, can it adapt? Is it overbuilt? Something like that, for the exercise that's going on. And do we have the ability to kind of, to change it? Do we have the ability to change anatomy? And then do we have the ability to change function? And I know the answer to this, largely speaking, but I want to hear it from you. And, just what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. And I think just to tack something onto that question is like, can breathing be improved?
Yes.
I think that's the ultimate conclusion here. But to get to that, I think those are two useful first points. It's just like, can we even change, is the lung plastic?
Mm-hmm.
And there's excellent work on this that, a good recent review by Jerome Dempsey, who's, a godfather in respiratory physiology, basically concluded that the lung. So for a long time, there was the conclusion that the respiratory system or the pulmonary system is overbuilt for exercise, and that generally that's not the limiter, just as you mentioned. But there's all these specific cases that are really adding asterisks to that statement, and in that review, he sort of pointed to these different contexts where it is indeed the case that the respiratory system does limit performance or can be a limiter to health or even safety, other things like that. And so, the lung doesn't change much. It does not adapt nearly as much as we thought it maybe could. And so that's the reason that a lot of elite athletes, for example, do experience breathing limitations, because they're operating at the maximal capacity of the lung in a lot of ways, right? And the airflows that they experience are near maximal for what the airway can tolerate, for example. And that's the reason that a lot of these elite athletes also experience airway limitations, such as ILO. Right? This exercise-induced laryngeal obstruction is a big problem. They used to consider it a sort of vocal fold disorder. So actually now it's mostly treated by speech pathologists. And they have some incredible treatments for this, where they can do real-time laryngoscopy during exercise. And we see how this happens. And again, this is part of the reason is that indeed there are lots of exceptions where the structure of the pulmonary system is indeed vulnerable to a lot of different limitations. And this especially presents itself in elite athletes, in adolescents, in the elderly, the active elderly population, and also in females. So there's a lot of documented evidence that females females in exercise experience more breathing limitations, and that's as a result of a lot of different, both structural and functional. We could just say limitations. Now, function-wise, I think is somewhat different. So, on the note of the structure, on the lung and the airways, we know there's specific aspects there that can be limited. Function, I think, is a bit less known. So, in part, this is because, and I don't know if this is so unpublished or if it's rather underexplored, but I haven't seen a lot of good experimental attempts to change breathing in this regard. And that's maybe an oversimplification, because there are examples of how breathing is changed. For example, in respiratory muscle training, this is a really good example to demonstrate how breathing can sort of be improved, or how respiratory limitations can be alleviated, right? And we know this works. There's two recent, systematic reviews with meta-analysis that show that, hey, respiratory muscle training works, and we have some idea of why. So we at least know the outcomes, where the mechanisms are not quite so clear.
Mm-hmm.
But we have an idea that, first, it reduces the respiratory muscle fatigue in the diaphragm, especially during higher exercise intensities above about 85%. It also reduces the subjective perception of breathlessness, that dyspnea that we know is part of the reason that exercise cessation or tolerance is reduced. And that also is accompanied by changes in breathing pattern. So after interventions with respiratory muscle training, individuals favor a pattern that is more tailored to depth versus rate. So they have a relative increase in depth, relative decrease in rate for the same VE after an intervention with respiratory muscle training. And so these things all sort of point, I think, to the fact that, maybe function is a little bit more flexible.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, the prevailing thought in this field is still this principle of minimal effort, that, hey, breathing is this tightly regulated, automated process that finds the path of least resistance, right? And this is primarily, I think, because of the belief in these pressure-volume relationships. If we expand tidal volume more greatly and go to a more slow and deep breathing pattern, maybe then we're actually sort of compromising some of the length tension relationship of the lung, and we're actually creating more work for the breathing muscles than if we had not changed it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, a sort of asterisk there, that I think misses part of the point of why we might want to change breathing in the first place. It's not just more efficient or more economic, right? That's not the only goal that we have to do these things. So that might be the main desire for an athlete, or even for the recreational runner or something. But there's lots of other reasons, either biomechanical or psychological, where breathing interventions could have an influence. And so, for example, is reducing dyspnea, right? This is a highly unpleasant, negative, affect condition that can be indeed changed with breathing interventions. Or, for example, nasal breathing, which is, I think, another good example. This is something that obviously can be changed. We can choose nose or mouth. It's not so easy to choose at higher exercise intensities. Whether or not it's more efficient, I think the jury is still out on that. There's some studies, but there needs to be a lot more before any consensus. But we know it does good things, for example, for reducing water loss, for maintaining airway quality and patency. And it probably has some psychophysiological benefits as well, where we know that nasal respiration entrains and parallels with certain oscillations in the brain. Mm-hmm. So how it affects autonomic balance in those ways is important. And then if we think of biomechanics even one step more, potentially we know the breathing muscles have this dual responsibility, not only for airflow generation, but also for postural stabilization. So can we affect the function of breathing to perhaps improve balance, core stabilization, reducing lower back injury? I think that's also an important thing to consider when we think about, can we improve breathing, or can we make breathing better? And so I don't want to blow up that question too big, but while the structures might be quite fixed, I think the function is quite malleable. And there's a lot of different ways we should interpret that depending on the benefits that we seek.
Yeah. The benefits that we seek, and the exercise intensity that we're going to be working at as well, right? Because
also,
you noted that nasal breathing, right? That's a huge thing, and that's actually how a lot of people, if you don't have physiological testing equipment and other things like that, that's kind of how people start to say, oh, well, can you nasal breathe until it's not comfortable anymore, and then switch, and that could be indicative of, say, your first threshold, for example. And in the paper you wrote, it was noted that up until about 40 liters per minute, nasal breathing can be pretty comfortable. Whereas after that, it's a little bit more, you gotta switch because you just have to move enough air, right? That's what it comes down to. But there are exceptions to that rule where people can also nasal breathe until about 85% of their VO2 max. However, I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the recommendation is nasal breathe at all costs, because there are limitations to how much air you can move in and out of your nose, and eventually that could cause some level of dysfunctional breathing pattern in if we want to put it back into those terms. So you're going to have to breathe faster, your tidal volume is going to go down, you're just not going to be able to do it well enough because your airways
you'll be under breathing.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really cool, and that's like kind of the purpose of your breath tools paper, which of course I'll link in the description, and if people really want to dive into it, I think I got most of the way through it today, and I had already like listened to another lecture you gave, which I'll also put in the description, which is kind of a summary of a lot of these tools. But like, would you mind just going through kind of like briefly the 7 sort of tools that you outlined in the breath tools paper, and how, and then we can get into like the how and why they can be implemented, because I think it's really good to describe like the different pattern or the different ways of changing breathing patterns. But then I also, and I think you appreciate this as well, is we need to get to the applicable portion of things. How do we measure if somebody has some level of disordered breathing, in a sense, because these different tools are going to be used in different circumstances, again, depending on exactly like what you said. Is it a performance outcome? Is it, more of a wellness psychological outcome? Because, they have great overlap, but they're going to be different.
Sure. Yeah. Where to start? I mean, a useful place to start was inspired by my editor on this paper, who suggested that we really focus on respiratory limited individuals. Yep. And that was a cool guiding light, let's say, for this topic, because it's true that maybe a majority of people don't experience breathing limitations per se in the majority of their exercise, right? Maybe we do notice it, but there's the people who could benefit most are the people who do indeed experience these limitations, which we estimate are probably 20, 40% of the population when we consider those special groups and some of those elements. And so, there's a lot of context to consider there. And I sort of categorized some of these like breath tools or breathing strategies. I would prefer to refer to them as ones that, let's say, make breathing easier or alleviate the limitations, versus maybe 2 or more that make it harder, that we use as like a stimulus in training. And so one of those, for example, is the respiratory muscle training. Maybe I won't dive into that because that's actually pretty well documented. And I mean, it just gives a good basis there, where what that's doing is actually providing resistance to usually the inhale, and in that sense, actually strengthening the diaphragm or making it more fatigue resistant. And that can be done in a number of different ways. One is what you mentioned, is isocapnic hyperpnea, or training masks or things like that. But maybe I'll start more on the sort of the ones that maybe make breathing easier, because I think these are interesting and they get talked about a lot, but I had seen a real lack of, let's say, categorizing this and phenotyping it in a clear way. So for me, the first one would be simply like slow paced breathing and lowering breathing rate. Right?
Yeah. And I want to say, I want to jump in real quick and just say this is relative. It's not like, you have to hit 10 breaths per minute. It's slower than what your normal, say, breathing would be.
Exactly. And I think we note that in the paper, that like all of this should be considered sort of individually, right? And how to get a sort of fingerprint of someone's breathing, or like a breath print, we might say, is maybe a good topic for after this. But if we look at someone's breathing before and then think about how to maybe where to start, I think a good first step is slowing down. And we know that this can be effective for multiple reasons. One being that effect of anatomical dead space, that we know that even just a small decrease in breathing rate can, as a consequence, cause the higher tidal volume and therefore better gas exchange. This is inherently, at least a little bit, some of the basis for this technique. I don't know if we consider it a technique, but we know that from of course thousands of years of yoga, from breath work, combat sports, that slow breathing has been prescribed in a number of different ways, and there is a physiological basis for it, right? We know that also psychologically it probably has some benefits for heart rate variability. Maybe that's debatable whether that actually applies during sport, where the sympathetic outflow is so big. But I think that's a good place to start. Our sort of second tool or strategy I just call deep, which is deep breathing. I think this term also gets thrown around a lot, and whether it's deep breathing or abdominal breathing or diaphragmatic breathing, we should distinguish those. And so what I mean by deep is not necessarily just larger tidal volume, which we just talked about, but actually specifically diaphragmatic breathing. And that's different than abdominal or belly breathing, because that's really a different compartment of the chest wall, right? The abdomen, like below the rib cage, is actually more important for exhale, for expiration, where the diaphragm primarily connects to those bottom three ribs, right? And is generally responsible for about 70% of the airflow generation of ventilation during exercise. So we know that it's important. It's very fatigue resistant, much more than the intercostals or the scalenes, which are the primary breathing muscles, let's say, on the pulmonary rib cage, the upper rib cage. And so there's a lot of reasons that we should choose, let's say, to use the diaphragm. Of course, it's not that easy to simply choose the diaphragm. Right. First, it's complicated because it's busy doing other things. So when we're running, for example, the diaphragm is pretty important for postural stabilization. So we see that there's, in just natural, spontaneous breathing during running versus cycling, there's lower diaphragmatic ribcage contributions to breathing. Right. This is actually some work on this was done by Kip, so Shalaya Kip, who you interviewed for another episode. So that's really interesting. Now, that's not to say that it's not participating in breathing or has some role in the coordination of these different compartments. This just simply says that, hey, maybe we need to be a little bit activity specific here, where how much diaphragmatic breathing is possible maybe needs to be adjusted to what we're doing. But inevitably, we know that the diaphragm contributes a lot to creating intra-abdominal pressure, which is pretty important for core stiffness if we're, for example, lifting something heavy. And we know that diaphragmatic breathing contributes a lot to like blood shifts in the torso and the intrathoracic pressure, which affects, of course, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is a thing during exercise. So diaphragmatic breathing has a lot of both, I would say, evidence-based, demonstrated benefits. Also a lot of like theoretical ones that we know apply during rest. We don't yet know during exercise. But I think there's at least a good case to try to breathe, more with the diaphragm during exercise. I think the nuances in how to cue that and how to feel that, because that's not so straightforward without like hands-on, either from a experienced practitioner or with some like wearable sensor biofeedback.
So yeah, that's really interesting because, whenever somebody says diaphragmatic breathing, I immediately think, oh yeah, try to pull the air into your belly button or something like that. But you're saying now that, because the diaphragm is really the three, is attached to the three bottom ribs, that is not necessarily the case. That's belly breathing, which, and then I could ask, well, if my intention is get it into my belly button in a sense, am I getting more engagement of the diaphragm anyways? And does that get me kind of closer, or maybe not?
Yeah, probably. Well, so if we think about, the diaphragm is a barrier between your upper thorax and your abdomen. Below your diaphragm and above your pelvic floor is all your guts, your abdominal viscera, your intestines and things. These are non-compressible. So if you expand your diaphragm, or if you contract your diaphragm, right, it descends and pushes on your intestines and all those other things in your abdomen. If your abdominal muscles are relaxed, yes, they will distend. Your belly will puff out. And that's not because you don't really have muscles in your abdomen that can expand very well. So they're actually expanding because we're like pushing down from the top and they're pushing out.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also possible to maintain some degree of core tension while we expand, while we contract our diaphragm. And therefore, either there's a little bit of compression going on there, or there's some movement of the pelvic floor, right? Which we can almost think of as like a second diaphragm. And that's a whole nother discussion, what the pelvic floor's role in breathing is. But we know that there's some important coordinated action of the pelvic floor that also contributes to breathing as well. And that's where the viscera go when we maintain some abdominal muscle tone during inhalation.
Interesting. So we've got slow, we've got
deep, and then maybe now we get a little more spicy. So the nose breathing is fascinating. Of course, this is also a hot topic. You've got people who are really espousing this for a variety of reasons. I would say the consensus is like at rest, breathing should be through the nose.
Yeah,
like it's really biologically evolved as a tissue to really facilitate breathing, where the mouth is much more for eating, talking, all these things. And so during exercise, it's not so clear. I think for a long time, people kind of said, "Oh, do whatever feels natural," and people saw no problem with mouth breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's a little more nuanced where, we know that, for example, mouth breathing is associated with increased water loss versus nose breathing of about 15 times.
Wow.
Right? It's a lot more. If you're in a hot, dry environment, this might be something you care about.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We know that the nitric oxide that's released in the nose during nasal breathing is both a vasodilator and a bronchodilator. And so if you have asthma or risk for example, exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, which is a large chunk of the population, you might care about these bronchodilating effects of the nose.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of other mechanisms we should care about as well, but this at least implies that, hey, there's some benefit for at least the airway to choose the nose.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think actually it is good to consider at least some nose breathing as a good choice during low intensity exercise.
Mm-hmm.
There's some case studies that have demonstrated that this is also trainable, that we can push this over months or maybe even years. We can start to use nose breathing at higher and higher intensities with comfort and without losing any economy.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it actually benefits economy or not, I think is controversial. There's some papers showing no benefit. There's one paper that did show some good benefit for VO2 and for cycling economy, and I think it's to be considered. Like, it needs more research, in part because it's difficult to study because it requires habituation. You can't just tell a mouth breather to switch to their nose and compare their VO2 pre-post. Right? We need to consider some habituation phase, because I think one of the bigger conclusions from the paper is these things are, if they're advantageous, they're only likely to be so after some learning, when it becomes automatic. And at some point, of course, the nose is very difficult to choose because you simply can't get big enough EE. And so, I think also Brian McKenzie made this comment that, if you're going nose all the time, then you're never really going hard, because above 90%, you can't, if you're always breathing through the nose, then you're never really getting above 90%, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had an individual reach out to me who, was, I think nose breathing kind of changed his life and his perception on things because of the benefits that he found through, more relaxation from the psychological, standpoint. Exercise at lower intensity seemed easier. And they were asking me, they were saying, well, I nose breathe now for everything, but my VO2 max isn't very high. And I was like, I was like, it's most likely because you have to switch to mouth breathing because you're going to be limiting your ability to move air at high exercise intensities. You said like 90% or above. So therefore you're going to be limited. The test isn't broken. Like you're actually, through your conscious use of your nasal breathing, overriding your body's actual ability to move enough air, especially at very high intensities. So I think that's where the nuance comes in. You can't just go, oh, because nose breathing is good at rest and good at low intensity, at least for me, from a psychological perspective and other things like that, means it's going to be the best for everything. It's not. So I just want to put that PSA out there for people is that, it may have benefits at lower exercise intensities and depending on how long you've trained it, other things like that. But then you eventually need to get to a point where you do mouth breathe and effectively mouth breathe, right? And we'll talk about that probably in just a little bit. Another thing I wanted to say is that, with a lot of like the studies, I think people look at acute shifts in these techniques to say breathing efficiency, work of breathing, other things like that. And there's most likely because it takes a long time to adapt. There's less studies out there that actually show, well, what happens if you can actually chronically adapt to say slow breathing, deep breathing, nasal breathing, those sort of things. So I think that is still TBD, but because we just don't have that knowledge yet, right?
That's right. I mean, that's what I'm working on right now. We've got a couple experiments going. And those types of studies are hard to do, right? Because they're also then field studies. You can't bring people into the lab for everything. Also, their breathing in the lab is different, right? Especially if you put a mask on people or if you tell them at all that you're studying breathing, they're gonna change it because they know they're being watched, right? That Hawthorne effect. But super interesting. I mean, and my focus has been mainly looking at changing breathing during exercise, right? Trying to actually bring the intervention to like during the run or cycling or whatever else. But there are some experiments. I mean, lots of the work of Sylvain Laborde, for example, in France, has shown, right, I think he's in Cologne now, that like resonant frequency or coherent breathing, heart rate variability, biofeedback, whatever you want to call it, this changes breathing pattern during sport when done during an intervention at rest for 6 to 8 weeks. So it's possible that there's a transfer of breathing learned at rest to also in sport. And maybe that applies with nasal breathing as well. I mean, so a couple final points on nasal breathing. Like, it's interesting that it's a smaller airway, and a lot of people see that as a limitation. But actually, it's good because, well, one, it filters the air, which is really important if you are in any area with poor air quality, or also in winter, for example, where there's viruses and bacteria and things, or if you're indoors. And also, that smaller airway seems to lead to, if we step back to those previous two tools, slow and deep, it seems to result in slower, deeper breathing, which we know is beneficial for a variety of reasons. And then again, although my focus has been on mainly during exercise, we know that has some important implications for at rest, right? If we think about how you should be breathing, let's say between interval efforts or after a hard session in the gym or after a threshold session, a race, switching to nasal breathing as soon as is comfortable is probably good for retaining, right, or regaining some autonomic nervous system balance, or reestablishing some airway quality, things like that can actually help you feel fresher the next day or the next week. And so I think it's important to consider in that sense. When we think about how to do it, like I'm somewhat bothered by the bipolar attitude towards nasal breathing as well, of like mouth taping or, choosing, nose only when you're below a certain threshold, whatever. I think what might help a lot of people, for example, you mentioned your client, athlete, whatever, who's having trouble at higher intensity, is this technique that they call breath splitting, which is really cool. We talk about it a little bit in the paper. And this was specifically developed for individuals who have this ILO, this airway problem of the larynx basically becoming occluded, almost similar to like exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. We used to call it exercise-induced asthma, although it's different how it presents itself. And this just allows people to get an inhale with a mix of the nose and the mouth. And so they teach this. The different speech pathologists teach this. I think they developed it actually in a hospital in Colorado. And now I actually recommend this as a way to get just some nose. Where we know, okay, just some nose breathing could be good for all those benefits we just talked about, for airway quality, preventing water loss, nitric oxide, these things. And so like one variant, for example, if I get embarrassingly close to my camera, try to do it. You can use your tongue on the roof of the mouth to block your mouth just for the first half. So it might look and sound something like this. Right, where the first half of my breath is in the nose, or in the nose. Second half of the inhale is in the mouth. And this is totally feasible at higher intensities. In fact, they do it in the clinic, right? In CPAT testing for these individuals. And this is something that's totally reasonable to prescribe to an athlete or whatever else at these higher intensities to get some of the benefits while still achieving these higher VEs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. There was another person who reached out to me on Instagram, and they were like, oh, well, I have, the ILO, and or at least I think it is. And she was wondering if there was anybody who had any sort of interventions or anything like that, or wanting to talk about this. So this one's for her.
Yeah.
If you are out there and you are listening, go to the YouTube video and watch this portion of it, because it was actually when you got really close to your camera, you could see, your tongue was stuck to the roof of your mouth for the first 50%, and then you kind of like released it. And how does that actually alleviate the constriction that you would feel, in your laryngeal area? Do you
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, good question. I think the mechanism behind it's pretty complicated. They've written this up in a couple of different papers.
Okay.
Right. This team at, I think are they at National Jewish Hospital in Denver? I think they've written up some of the like supposed mechanisms, and I think it has something to do with like changing the velocity of airflow into the larynx, and especially if we think about the like physics of it and laminar flow, things like that, there's the Bernoulli principle, I believe, is basically responsible when you have very high degrees of airflow. It actually causes a closed, airway or container to collapse. And so if we can slow down that airflow, it reduces this pressure effect basically on the walls of the airway, and can provide some relief, especially at these higher intensities.
Interesting. Yeah, I noticed. So I was doing, some respiratory muscle training a little while ago, and when I would get up to really deep, really high frequencies and do it a lot over time, I would feel the muscles in my neck and my throat and other things like that being very engaged. And I've never experienced that actually during exercise. So it was just something that was really interesting to me, because I was like, wow, I feel like, everything kind of has to either go out, or I'm getting tired in this area. And, and that's again, what you were saying is anywhere from 20 to 60 muscles, depending on who you're talking to, is involved in breathing. And that's greatly different, but it's just another, it seems like to me is we know a lot, or at least we think we know a lot, but there's still a lot to be uncovered, especially with the exercise interventions, not just the rest interventions, right? So
there's two more of these tools that I should talk about. And these ones are maybe a bit more, they're not quite fringe, but we should say they're not typically thought of as elements of breathing pattern. They're quite clearly more techniques rather than just, nose versus mouth is simply airway choice, right? Maybe the first one I'll call active exhale. And this one's pretty cool. I think it's relatively untested, although there's evidence of people experimenting with this in the literature up to 50 years ago. Wow. And so we know that longer exhales have been used for 3,000 years in different yoga practices, right? And lots of people do this subjectively. We know that at rest, different breathing techniques at rest often recommend longer exhales because they preferentially activate parasympathetic, vagal drive and things like that. And so there's a number of different potential benefits that we could say transfer to exercise. And so the longer exhale, we also know that has a longer exhale at the same VE would result in lower air velocities in the airway. So potentially that contributes to that irritation we just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's one of the smaller effects. But when I think of the active exhale, it's not just longer, but also stronger, and maybe with phonation. So stronger means I use the cue with people of squeeze all the air out. So a conscious recruitment of the expiratory musculature,
mm-hmm.
right? And this is really the abdominal muscles, primarily the obliques. And part of the reason that this might be effective is because lots of individuals, especially those with air trapping, for example, if they have COPD or asthma, but also lots of others who experience many of these respiratory limitations, these groups that I talked about earlier, experience this dynamic hyperinflation that above about 85% max or something around there, high intensity exercise, the lungs start to get bigger, right? The end inspiratory and the end expiratory volume starts to increase. If you imagine your lungs are like a balloon, at higher intensities, that balloon is, even though it's going in and out, it's bigger. Mm-hmm. And this is a limiter because the increase in intrathoracic pressure puts pressure on the heart and can affect the emptying and filling of the heart. And so you appreciate this, of course. Okay, we know that there's cardiovascular limitations to exercise tolerance and cessation, but maybe those are indeed influenced by respiration, by breathing itself. And so to give that cue to squeeze all the air out is directly an attempt to attenuate that, right? To actually keep the end expiratory volume lower, to keep that balloon closer to its natural size. Mm-hmm. We also know that those muscles have an important role in postural stabilization, of course. So potentially this has benefits for any activity that requires core stabilization, which is most of them, maybe not cycling. So I think there's a lot of reasons that we should cue people, let's say, to squeeze all the air out. Mm-hmm. The final part of this, I think, is still a question mark. So phonation, we actually, I talked to a group in Slovenia that's actually studying this. So the effect of using different sounds in the exhale. This is, again, sort of stolen from a number of other breath work and yoga practices. The idea of maybe humming or making some sound on the exhale, whether it's or like a sound, any of those. This has now been studied, and it was pretty interesting, although kind of debatable if it really resulted in an effect. I think part of the basis for this came from when we know that humming on the exhale increases the concentration of nitric oxide in the airway. So what the nose already releases, which is a bronchodilator and a vasodilator, perhaps adding humming can actually add some more nitric oxide to the system. Or whether it's the humming or a sh sound or a s sound, we're also adding more resistance to the exhale, which would potentially slow it down, which might result in that just overall slower breathing, which we know is somewhat beneficial. And it increases that expiratory pressure, which we know there's studies on, like auto PEEP is the technical term, or pursed lips breathing, which we know in hypoxia or at elevation can help to actually maintain normal oxygen balance in the system, right? It can actually increase SpO2 and SaO2 and has been used as a treatment for hypoxia and a variety of high altitude conditions like HAPE. So this is interesting when we consider a specific restrictions concerning hypoxia and elevation. Or potentially adding that phonation or any sort of back pressure to the exhale could help maintain better biochemical homeostasis or attenuate the effects of hypoxia. So that's the active exhale is three different things: longer, stronger, and maybe with phonation. This has had very few studies, and the studies that do exist, I would say, are fairly low quality. Although the theoretical mechanisms, I think, are somewhat convincing. I would love to see more studies of it. And it's something that although there's yet evidence, it's something that I experiment with myself.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting. Is there any, like, because there's talk of like, over breathing and other things like that with this active exhale, is that a risk of, are you, like if you are, say you're doing this at like lower exercise intensities, not high exercise intensities, which again, you're trying to just at high exercise intensities maintain, some stability in the system. Because if you can't, then you're going to fall apart and you're going to fatigue. That's like what ultimately is happening. But if for example, if you were like, oh, this active exhale thing seems like a really good idea, I'm going to try it during my lower exercise intensity stuff, is there a risk of blowing off, say, too much CO2 and, then at the level of the muscle, creating some level of Bohr effect that doesn't allow for oxygen to actually be offloaded. And then it gives you the guise of, oh, well, we're protecting SpO2 or something like that. Or am I completely backwards with this sort of thought process?
No. That's a totally valid critique. I think that's a risk with any of these. So there's the potential when we interfere with breathing or any highly automated biological process that we are disturbing that system and potentially pulling it out of homeostasis. So, I mean, there's some evidence that mouth breathing disturbs oxygen CO2 balance at rest, which is, I think, part of the recommendation that people think, we should use the nose during exercise because the mouth results in overbreathing. I'm not sure I buy that logic because I haven't yet seen evidence that mouth breathing during exercise results in overbreathing. Right? And we would determine that by either traditional spirometry or just capnometry, and actually seeing, hey, is that end tidal CO2 outside of a normal range? Is it above 45 or whatever? I haven't seen evidence for that, and of course that's something that we look at in our studies here. Is hey, when we change that breathing just acutely, is that pulling them out of that normal CO2 range that we would expect, and that would be evidence of that over breathing or not, and that's something that we indeed monitor. In general, when we do manipulations here of breathing, we're usually pushing people towards either similar breathing rates, very close to what they're already doing, or slower. And so we actually, we rarely see any degree of hypocapnia. If anything, we see hypercapnia. Because if we push somebody too slow, then they're actually under breathing, right? They can slow the breathing rate, but they can only increase tidal volume so much. Maybe the result is that they're under breathing. And that is of course a risk, although one that I would consider less problematic, right? Because then we can remind people, hey, go back to normal breathing. Okay, stop. And that tends to be somewhat self-correcting. Right. Whereas the overbreathing, right, hypocapnia is not always self-correcting. And when somebody gets very hypocapnic, it can cause various symptoms, or could cause something worse, like a panic attack. And we know that in those cases, the only real treatment we have in case of emergency, if we're in the lab or something, would be something like giving somebody a paper bag to breathe into to try to regain, isocapnia.
CO2. Yeah. That's
and we have
really interesting.
We have other things in our emergency plan, whatever. But maybe get a little off topic, but I hope that answers your question.
No, that's super interesting. Is it's like, just to summarize, the risk of, say, underbreathing, where you have higher CO2, is a little bit more self-correcting, whereas the overbreathing seems to be a little bit more, dangerous, especially on the far side of things. Can lead to panic attacks, like other things like that. And it's interesting because, like, if you think about it, if you do raise CO2 enough, then that's going to trigger all of these, kind of like autonomic responses to breathe more.
That's right.
That's what I talk about this in exercise physiology all the time, is your brain and your body is extremely responsive to small changes in CO2. So that actually kind of brings up another one, which is like kind of breath hold or CO2 tolerance sort of stuff. Cause that's another huge one that has been talked about. And like, my argument would be is that when you exercise, you're creating an enormous amount of CO2. And I don't have the ability to measure, PCO2 in the blood or expiratory CO2, out of the mouth. But would exercise just give you more, say, CO2 tolerance in general? And does it really even matter? Like, do you need to build your CO2 tolerance other than if you're a swimmer or a deep water diver, somebody who's like really focused on breath hold stuff?
Yeah. Another hot topic, of course. We see a lot of people pushing breath hold tests, advocating for CO2 tolerance or these breathing ladders, right, to try to establish that. Well, look, maybe there's some interesting applications perhaps at rest or for clinical conditions where CO2 tolerance could be an interesting topic for treatment. Regarding exercise, I am not yet convinced that this is very important. I mean, first, there's a recent experiment that actually looked at CO2 tolerance, and they specifically looked at breath holding tests in different levels of athletes and saw that there was no real predictive capability for breath holding tests based on athlete level. So there was no evidence that this correlates with performance, the performance on the breath hold test. Second, also with CO2 tolerance, I'm not yet convinced that there's any strong benefit for athletes to expand that. However, I think theoretically it does make sense, because if I think to a different topic in exercise physiology that's of course gotten a lot of attention, which is bicarbonate supplementation, right? We know that part of the reason that it increases exercise tolerance, especially at higher intensities, is because it buffers hydrogen ions and increases the how should we say, comfort of metabolic acidosis, right? And that is effectively CO2 tolerance. And so if this is something we can also manipulate with breathing, then that might be effective for improving performance, above steady state exercise, or especially above VO2 max, real maximal performances. We say maximal, not sprinting necessarily, but somewhere in between, right?
Right.
And in that sense, I think like theoretically the case is there, but I haven't seen any convincing evidence for it yet. In part because I think it's not so clear how to train it, but there is one way that maybe it can be trained that I'll touch on in another tool.
Okay. Yeah, because it's just really interesting to me that, again, I think a lot of times, people are like, oh, well, this worked really, really well for people who are, trying to improve their breath hold, or like, for swimmers, for example, right? Like swimmers, you have to have some level of breath hold tolerance and, probably, to some level CO2 tolerance, because if you're, doing 3 strokes, right, before you breathe, or runners, we don't ever have that constraint. So when we get into the pool, it's like, oh, I got to breathe like every single stroke. And so, so like I said, there's probably some, happy medium here where depending on the type of exercise you're doing, it would be beneficial, to increase your CO2 tolerance. But I'm more studies need to be done, right? That's what the bottom line is.
I mean, perfect segue that you mentioned swimming, which is interesting because they do train this, right? We know that plenty of swimmers and swim coaches focus on, various structured workouts that involve under breathing.
Right.
And so this inherently increases the PaCO2, which is probably related to some training adaptations that, need to be studied more. Honestly, I haven't dove so much into swimming just because it hasn't been my focus, but maybe they have looked at that in some of the literature of the effect of some of those workouts or the exclusion of some of those workouts, et cetera.
Right.
Also interesting, of course, that you mentioned the timing of breathing, the coordination of breathing with movement in swimming, because swimming has this, right? Coupling, we would call it locomotor respiratory coupling, is a requirement in swimming. You must breathe in between strokes, otherwise you're inhaling water. And very interesting to see the patterns that people choose. I'm always watching like the Paris Olympics this year was super interesting to see just what patterns people choose and how different it can be between even these high level athletes, where you would think that some self-selection would actually pull them towards an average.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a constraint in running or in cycling or in lots of other activities, but nonetheless, we do see it, which is interesting. So estimates of the prevalence of coupling in like cycling, for example, are between 20 and 80%, which is really, really wide.
Yeah.
But in running, we know that a lot of people are doing this. And this has fascinated me because not only am I a runner, but I'm also a musician. And to me, this is sort of like the music of running, right? Is that timing, that coordination between step and breath. And so I also think of this as some element of breathing pattern is coupling. And maybe that's like a subcategory of coordination, right? Not just the coordination of upper and lower rib cage, but the coordination with movement. And this is, I think also a valuable sort of strategy to think about, because when we think about that timing, or we think about that longer exhale, this is something that can be incorporated into coupling. And when we consider how common this is, right, that it's seen across a number of different activities and different populations, et cetera, I think the intuitive conclusion here is, hey, this is something natural. Our brains are synchronization machines. We naturally synchronize our movement to external oscillators as well. We naturally synchronize our breathing to different movements and tempos and things like that. And so maybe we could exploit this specifically in sport. And this has been my main work. So stop me if I'm too deep.
No, this is great.
It's interesting because in different activities, there's also different there's different factors that influence its occurrence, that drive its prevalence and whether or not it might be beneficial. So running is interesting because although this vertical torso that us humans have means we don't need to breathe with our step, when we step, our viscera or guts below our diaphragm, they actually bounce up and down. They have this vertical oscillation, and that because they're ligamentously attached to the diaphragm, they actually pull on the diaphragm a little bit every step. And so this visceral piston, they call it, creates what are then called step-driven flows. Each step affects airflow just a little bit. And there were a lot of studies on its prevalence and the spontaneity of it before, but there's only one really good study that looked at like the degree of step-driven flow and how much does this really affect VE, whether it's synchronized, whether your breathing is synchronized or not. And they estimated about 10% of VE. That when your breath is synchronized to your step, it could increase VE. It's almost like free work, right, for the diaphragm. You're taking advantage of that downward momentum of the viscera to get like free tidal volume. Vice versa, when it's unsynchronized, it could potentially harm VE up to 10%. I think that's a pretty big implication.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when VE can get up to, 150, 180, 200. That's 20 liters, potential 20 liters that if you are not synchronized, especially during running, might be a little bit less important for, say cycling where, everything is kind of, you're not bouncing up and down.
That's right.
So continue. Yeah, this is cool.
So, and I should say this is one study that's pretty high quality, but not replicated. We need to replicate this to really see what the implications of this are. I would love to see it done with like worker breathing, which is something that they're doing in the UBC lab where Shalaya Kip was. But this is an incredibly invasive, you have to swallow a balloon catheter down into your esophagus. There's very few places that can do this sort of study. And frankly, my lab isn't one of them. I would love to do that and replicate that to see how does this actually affect the work of breathing? How does this affect the economy of the diaphragm and the breathing muscles? What's the consequences of this? Interesting that you mentioned cycling because this is one where, there's no, what I just described as step-driven flow is really a biomechanical mechanism, right? This doesn't exist in cycling. So there's no torso movement that would imply that this coupling would emerge naturally. And as such, coupling which we know does occur in cycling, is likely purely neurogenic, right? It's likely psychological, where the motor output from the type 4 neurons in the legs is driving your brain to feel the rhythm, so to speak. And that's why that occurs.
What about potential, like, skeletal muscle pump? Like, could that have some level of effect on like the that synchronicity that we're talking about? Or is that just because that is related to the ability, if your skeletal muscle pump is kind of synchronized with your heart rate filling and then contraction, then you actually get larger expansion of the chambers of the heart, and then you can push more blood.
For sure. Well, and that's a different coupling that we can also consider. This has been studied actually a lot more, at least in rest and in clinical conditions, is the coupling between breathing and heart. So yeah, we know that during inspiration, of course, ventricular filling can be increased. And then during exhalation, because that pressure is increased, that can increase the emptying of the heart. And potentially that could be, also exploited to improve cardiovascular function. I mean, that has been looked at in some studies of diaphragmatic breathing, resonant frequency breathing. That's one of the contributing mechanisms towards the cardiovascular benefits of those breathing techniques. I think it's rather unstudied during sport, or whether that can be exploited has definitely not been studied as far as I see. But likely contributes. So yeah, when we think of skeletal muscle pump, I mean, we know that contributes to cardiolocomotor coupling, right? And during walking or running, we can synchronize movement with the heart cycle if we synchronize the skeletal muscle pump with diastole, and different groups have studied this, then we can really get a lot of benefits that indeed they've actually looked at some of the outcomes for this with increased performance, and not only with the knowledge of the mechanism.
Yeah.
So that's cool. But a different coupling, of course.
Yeah. No, I know it's really interesting how all of this stuff and whether or not, like you just said, we can actually take advantage of that, or is that just something that kind of comes along, with what we're doing. I think, is interesting. But just to kind of round things back to, like the techniques that you were talking, or the strategies you were talking about earlier, like nasal breathing helps you to, breathe a little bit deeper, breathe a little bit slower. It seems like, like if it's possible to slow things down, make things a little bit more deeper, you're going to give your body more of the ability to say, fill your heart better, right? Like we were just talking about.
Maybe.
Or and this is, again, these are all maybes, but it's all seems to come back to, oh, well, if we can shift away, a little bit from, kind of like a high breathing frequency, and have more, maybe lower, slower breathing, then that could help us out. Obviously, like I said, when you're getting 80, 85, 90% of VO2 max, shit's hitting the fan. And, you just need to do everything you possibly can in order to try to maintain, the air in, the air out, everything you can possibly do. But again, maybe these strategies are more important, especially towards the end of, exercise, when there
Certainly
is a tendency for people to, just kind of go off the rails with their respiratory frequency. If you all of a sudden just start breathing like crazy, you're going to potentially limit your heart's ability to fill with adequate amounts of blood, even if you are, contracting really hard, every step. So
sure.
Yeah, so that's just kind of like I'm picking up, it seems like, on patterns here, of, well, all of these strategies other than the first two all affect, the slowness and the deepness of your breathing. You're like, maybe those are the the things.
Yeah, those are general heuristic, that would apply during exercise, tending towards slow, deep, rhythmic. There's also evidence that like elite athletes have more rhythmicity, less variability in their breathing rate, where high levels of variability and complexity are considered a breathing pattern disorder. And so those are definitely. And then if we can exploit, I think the active exhale, even at higher intensities, might be beneficial. Coupling definitely has some potential that we're investigating right now. I think these things are all worthwhile to play with, because we have there's actually a lot of evidence that they might be effective. And that's the attempt in the papers to sort of cobble together, okay, what's theoretical evidence? What do we know from rest conditions, different respiratory pathologies, and what's really been tested in exercise? And, when I see just what's come out in the last 2 years since we published that, there's a lot of follow-up and increased attention to these things as well.
Yeah.
I think a missing piece is how to maybe experiment or guide people towards this, whether you're interested yourself as an athlete or whatever, or as a coach or a practitioner wanting to guide it. I think part of what's missing is wearable technologies that can tell us if people are actually achieving, accomplishing, or adhering to the technique that they're trying to learn, and how to quantify that. And then maybe some biofeedback that can actually give people something to interact with to improve that. So diaphragmatic breathing is a great example. It's one thing to tell people to do more. It's another to actually be able to measure, hey, you were at 25%. That last interval was 30%. Good job. Keep going. It's a whole nother one to have live biofeedback, where maybe you could actually hear via audio, or you could feel via haptic feedback that, hey, yes, in this moment, that's more. Oh yeah, that's the feeling. And to get that instant feedback to know whether you're actually integrating those cues into your automatic pattern. And then, if we're really going to be complete in our practice, we should also do a pre-test and a post-test, and to really check then weeks, months later, hey, did what we have changed really work? Do we are we confident in our baseline? And then how confident are we on this post-test? Can we do some field tests and some lab tests to really have a good picture for how this person has changed and what are the consequences?
Yeah. So I get, this is actually kind of getting, towards well, how would somebody go about, say measuring, say a pulmonary limitation via your definition? Because the way that I do it is, I have spirometry testing where I can do, FVC, FEV1 and get the ratio just to make sure that people aren't under kind of that, 0.8, 0.75, depending on, what you're looking at. Because I'm pretty sure that's been a marker of things like COPD and other things like that. And then you're like, okay, well, now we can follow up and we can, either prescribe, some sort of drug or some sort of, breathing intervention. But then I always love to see if that is something that is also present during exercise. So what I have been doing is I'm lucky enough to have a VO2 master device. And what they do is they do breath by breath, and you can get respiratory frequency and tidal volume along with minute ventilation. And one of the things I always do is I like to measure that. So if for example their spirometry test comes back and I'm like, oh, it looks kind of good, I like to see, okay, what's happening during exercise, and when do you start to say maximize tidal volume? Is there a maximization in tidal volume? And then how does that respiratory frequency change, and what can it get up to while still maintaining tidal volume? Because I've found with people that people who, may have, this idea of especially wearing a mask, this panic breathing, what happens is eventually they get to this respiratory frequency that just gets too high, and too high is relative term, where tidal volume then starts to fall off. And, and then it's you're like, okay, well, they're going to fatigue right now. It's going to happen. And they're probably going to have some level of, panic or, psychological, oh my gosh, I felt like I was drowning in the mask, or, claustrophobic. So, is there if you were to get an athlete or something like that, what sort of tests would you run them through to then be like, oh, well, maybe we need to breathe a little bit deeper. Maybe we need to, change or implement one of these strategies we're talking about.
Yeah. Broad question. I think it depends as a practitioner versus a researcher, what I would see. Right. Do I have an hour with the person, or do I have, weeks? And do I have a laboratory, or am I in their basement? These are different. I think these new mobile spirometry systems are pretty cool. I also have one. Um, and I think Moxie is also really cool. We also use one in my recent studies.
Oh, sweet.
And particularly interesting because we can monitor that metabo reflex, right? The blood stealing that happens during exercise. So when someone gets above about 85%, we see this maybe slight decline in peripheral oxygenation, and that's interesting to see where that happens and to what degree that happens, because that's something we think we can actually manipulate with breathing. My favorite tool that I'm using these days is a shirt. It's the Hexoskin, which has breathing sensors at the thoracic and abdominal level. So we get some idea of the ratio of upper chest to abdominal breathing. And it's just really ready for field studies because it also has an accelerometer. It has one lead ECG. We get a lot of cool stuff from that. But I think the real secret sauce is in like how you use these things, what sort of protocols, et cetera. So we do a mix of things. I do a lot of incremental tests to exhaustion. So do ramp tests. We do step tests, and usually on the treadmill, we'll do either speed or incline because those things manipulate breathing differently, right? So when we change just incline, of course, we're increasing physiological intensity, but maintaining the same motor rhythm, which is important at least for coupling. And we know that this also affects breathing in certain ways, just breathing rate by itself. Versus when we do speed, we're of course increasing both, right? Step rate is increasing and also, just physical load. So it's interesting to have incremental tests that are both speed and incline based. And that's something that of course you could replicate outdoors. Maybe not incremental, but you could put people with some of these sensors, on a track versus on a hill or on a mountain. And I think that's pretty interesting for seeing how someone's breathing pattern responds. And then we also do plenty of continuous and interval modalities as well. So low intensity work, threshold work, typical interval workouts of 30-30, 15 by 1 minute, 5 by 4. These things are pretty interesting as well because those affect breathing differently. And in my opinion, these provide a really good hotbed for testing some of these techniques, because then you have the ability to do some, multiple conditions within a trial. So as an example, if you're going to prescribe, some slow breathing, deep breathing, or coupling in a specific ratio, you have the ability to do, version 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, do some repeats and to see just first, how do they tolerate it? I always ask subjective, scales, whether it's breathlessness or fatigue, any of those things. And then of course, checking on the different physiological markers that we care about, whether that's CO2 concentration or thoracic to abdominal breathing, or of course just VO2 and economy. These things are always interesting as well. So some combination of lab, field, sensors, different protocols. I don't have one clear way, but I think the main point would be actually exactly what you're talking, is that looking at breathing rate and tidal volume, how those trend throughout exercise tells us a lot.
Yeah, that's and I think for most people too, it's still a relatively inaccessible, sort of like metrics, right? Tidal volume and breathing frequency. It's getting better, with like the Hexoskin being available, and there's another one called the Timeware. Not sponsored or anything, but people have been talking about that, and it's one of those things where I think those will start to get more affordable, be more accessible, as long as we can, kind of like, trust the data that's coming from these pieces of software. Then it's like, okay, well now how can we start to use it as, tools? And, like, it's really interesting because every once in a while I'll get these like nuggets of wisdom, or like all the things that you're talking about today. I'm like, man, something that helped me so much. And I haven't tested one way or the other, is when I am doing like, say, a VO2 max test or a 5-minute all out test, just to see what my VO2 max is. If when I'm getting really, really tired, do something where I'm consciously, hard inhale and then, doing the active exhale. And it could either be, there might be a little bit of, phonation to it, but other times, maybe not. That actually, I think, has been a huge difference in terms of just the VO2 max I personally can get up to. And then I find with running, though, I'm much more limited flat ground when it comes to, like high intensity stuff, because I'm not able to, compared to cycling, I'm not able to coordinate that breathing quite as much. There's a little bit more of like, the stability nature of things and that. But up a hill, I have this massive hill in my backyard that I do, like 5 minute, pretty much like VO2 max style intervals. I'm getting to the point where I'm like, all right, now I can actually breathe the same way that I do during my cycling. And I think it's helping me personally, at least with those really, really high exercise intensities. But again, this is just like anecdotal stuff that I've, kind of learned over time.
Sure.
And now you're like there might be some good explanations to it, based on, what we've talked about today. Yeah.
But the anecdotal is also valuable. I don't want to come off as just like this hardliner research of like, if there's not evidence, it's not real. Like if you feel it, it is real. Right. That's a very important reality. The possibility is that it's a placebo, and placebos are also real. Like this is a very valuable construct we should appreciate in science, that if it feels better, you're right.
Right.
Now, whether it's physiologically advantageous is a question mark. Like if you do this, right, we see this in a lot of people. They take, how I would label it as like a sigh, or some people think of it as like a reset breath or a rescue breath, one big, and then they go back to their high intensity breathing. To throw that in there is super interesting, because that does have physiological implications, right? It's going to change your CO2 balance. Immediately after, you're going to have higher CO2 concentration. But the question is, are you going from hypocapnia to isocapnia, or isocapnia to hypercapnia? I don't know. And then did you truly choose to do that in that moment? Like, is it totally deliberate, or is there actually some conscious driver there? Maybe this physiology that is driving that choice to have this deep breath now. And then there's also this psychological mechanism of relief. Did you do it because it provides you relief, or because you think it will provide you relief, like anticipation of? It's actually funny that you mentioned this, because I'm right now putting together a big analysis and a paper on sighing in exercise, and we have a comparison of different workout types. So like low intensity, threshold, incremental tests versus all these different HIIT types. We compare fit versus unfit, and males and females and other things. And it's fascinating to see just first, when do people sigh, and what types of sighs? Is it a big breath? Is it a long breath? Is it a big and long breath? These things, and there's definitely implications for it. But all of this is to say breathing is fascinating, and there's definitely a lot more to learn. Sighing is also an element of breathing pattern that deserves a little more attention, perhaps, in the exercise science.
Yeah, just again, just going back to kind of anecdotal evidence. One of my coaches back in the day, he would be like, "Oh, well, if you ever start to get like a side stitch or something like that, do like a deliberate." It wasn't a sigh, but it was like an active exhale all the way out. And it was one of those things that also stuck with me, because in the middle of a cross country race, inevitably you're going to get some sort of side stitch, or if you're lucky enough not to, then you don't. But, from a majority of people, they do. And just having that kind of like conscious, like, oh, just breathe out everything, almost seemed to, and whether this is placebo or not, I don't know, but reset. And then you get back to your normal breathing. And then actually like 99% of the time for me personally, that actually fixed, like the cramping that I was having. But then the synchronization thing too, that, we talked about earlier, that could also be, in effect, where it's like, oh, well, maybe by doing that really deep exhale, that sigh, you're getting to a point where you're resetting, so now it's 2, 3, or, like whatever the breathing pattern is.
Yeah. Maybe you were just resetting the rhythm. That's the the breath to step coupling. That's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, this is maybe this is a good practical takeaway for lots of people. We know that stitch is still somewhat mysterious. And it's likely caused in many cases by either fluid or food in the stomach. That definitely causes stitch in many cases. In the other cases, it's not so clear. And the presentation of it can be different in people, but there is some convincing evidence, at least convinced me, that phrenic nerve irritation is to blame. And perhaps that breathing, or especially exhaling on the same leg repeatedly, can irritate that nerve. And so, this is just one way that perhaps one of these breathing techniques can be operationalized pretty quickly and easily for people is, if you just alternate which legs that you're exhaling on, that actually attenuates that stitch, right? And we've experimented with this a little bit. I think it still needs more work, but heard also lots of anecdotal reports from friends and other runners that, hey, that worked. So it's exactly experimental questions like that start to also go back and solve some of these mechanisms that are still somewhat unknown. So coupling for the stitch, I think, definitely a cool recommendation. And at worst, it's harmless, right?
Right.
And I think someone else mentioned that in one of your episodes. Hey, if you want to manipulate some of these breathing techniques and change breathing pattern, it's not zero risk, but it's very low risk. And if it feels good, then try it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Eric, this has been an absolute masterclass, I think, on, like breathing and the state of kind of like the research and what do we know and then application and stuff like that. If you guys are interested in reading kind of like the paper that we're talking about, I'll link it in the description. It's actually, it's freely available through Frontiers, which is awesome. So you should be able to go grab that. I'll also link a video, of Eric's, he gave a talk at a conference as well that actually got me onto all of this sort of stuff. Eric, is there anything else that you want to, like plug, or, where can people find you if they want to, maybe reach out with questions? They can also direct the questions at me, and then I can ask you if I can't answer them myself.
Sure. No, I pretty much hide out these days. I'm only on, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on ResearchGate. I eschew all other social media right now. So Strava, if you're there, actually. Yep. It's my favorite. So.
I was going to say probably a smart decision, given the state of arguments and other things like that. I know I kind of, put my feet in the fire by just being like, oh yeah, everybody just reach out to me on Instagram, but
I do miss some of the chatter, let's say in the pop science talks around it. So no, LinkedIn, if anybody wants to contact, for sure. I'm open to talk about breathing anytime.
Awesome. And if, in the meantime, if you have any papers that come out or anything like that, let me know. And I'd be happy to, share them with people, get more eyes on this sort of stuff, because it's being talked about, I think, for a reason. I think, people see breathing as something that can be, greatly beneficial in changing potentially breathing patterns. And then, in my line of work with physiological testing and other things like that, we do find that a lot of people, may be pulmonary limited, which is again kind of against the grain in terms of previously followed information. So I think you're doing great work, man. I really look forward to actually like the different papers that you have coming out and all of that, and let me know when they do come out so I can read them and again push them out to the audience. If you guys have any questions, you can always find me at Critical02. If you're on YouTube, you can comment down below with any of the questions that you have. If you're on Spotify, you can even comment on there. I really appreciate everybody listening. Eric, again, I appreciate you coming on. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.